All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joe Young. I am one of the Assistant Directors of Disability Resources here at Case Western Reserve University. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about our different policies and how our office works. There will be time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions during so, I will try to check the chat as much as possible. All right. So, yeah, we'll be going over how ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, works in higher education, because that is the set of laws that our students will be working with here in higher ed. So it will be a change from high school. We will also be talking about our resources, our policies, and procedures. We will go over some of the group information as far as how our office works, and then along with our contact information if you have any questions that do come up outside of our session today. But if you do have any questions during the sessions, feel free to ask them in the chat section. I'll try to check that as best as I can. Though, if you have any specific questions about what we can do for specific diagnoses, so you're like, my child has a ADHD, what can we do? I would prefer for those questions to be emailed to us, and we'll send you our contact information here at the end, just because we deal with everything on a case-by-case basis. But any of those general questions, feel free to pop those on in as we go along. All right, so to get started, ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, in higher education. So pretty much what ADA says is that it's an equal opportunity for students with disabilities. They are entitled to benefit from all the services of those institutions and to use campus facilities. And how the ADA defines disability is any mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So especially here on campus, those major life activities will be learning and participating in a lot of our programs. So what we will be doing is following ADA guidelines to figure out what is reasonable for our students. Some of the differences that can be from how accommodations work in K-12, if you've received those before there, as opposed to ADA and Section 504 in higher education. In K-12, with the Free Appropriate Public Education, or FAPE, they focus on modifications of programs so then students can succeed in their classes. So their students are, the school district is responsible for identifying students with disabilities, and they are also responsible for evaluating that. So providing any of the testing that's needed for students to receive the diagnoses that they may have. Parents also consent to evaluations and advocacy. So parents are in the driver's seat, or family members, and the child's information is accessible to the parent. So you're easily able to get online, see what grades are looking like, talking to teachers and those sorts of things, and they're able to share that sort of information freely. And in school, disability is defined by specific categories. So there's different umbrellas for how they work and define those different disabilities. But how things can look really different in higher education under ADA and Section 504 is that students must self-identify. So it's up to the student to reach out to our office, and we'll talk about that process later on. But to reach out to us and to identify that they do have a disability. We do not automatically get 504 information if students have a 504 plan or any other educational plan in school. Those aren't sent to us, so the students do need to reach out to us to start the process. Students must provide supporting documentation. We do have our documentation guidelines on our website, but we will not be providing the testing for that. We do have some resources on campus, depending on the diagnosis, where students can get tested. But overall, it's up to the student to find those, or to get that documentation for us. Students, and this is usually the biggest change for people with using accommodations here that have used them before, students are responsible for advocacy. So students are going to be in the driver's seat. And so if there's ever any difficulties with classes or anything like that, students will need to talk to their instructors. They need to reach out to us to let us know what's happening, but we will not be reaching out to family members or anything like that if there's any grades that aren't looking too good or anything like that. And sometimes that can be really hard. And say if as a family member or parent may be reaching out to us and be like, hey, how's everything going? All that we can really say due to these laws is that the student is registered with our office. But so it's up to the student to really say who we can talk to, what we can talk to about, and really take control of that advocacy as far as how they work with their disability on campus. FERPA, and we'll be talking more in detail about that in a subsequent slide. Communication overall is between us and the student only. We will reach out to family members if there is a need to know basis. So if there is an emergency of some sort, of course, we will be reaching out to you. But again, anything general about grades or anything like that, that communication is going to stay between the students and ourselves, and then any of our campus partners that may have that need to know basis. In here, disability is defined as a significant limitation to a major life function. So again, anything that impacts learning, living on campus, eating, anything like that, we will look at the options that we can. So FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. Pretty much what that is what information that we can release. So the 1974 Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act is a federal law, and that protects the privacy of a student's educational record. FERPA applies to all educational institutions receiving funds from the United States Department of Education from kindergarten through the university level. So under FERPA at the higher education level, the Disability Resource Office may not share the contents of a student's file with anyone other than the student unless the student provides written consent to do so. So even, over the summer, we do an intake with the student and the families are all, we're all together, we've all talked, we all got to know each other. If you reach out to us, email us, be like, hey, how's my kid doing? Again, we can't really share much information outside of the student is registered with our office. Beyond that, we'll need written consent from the student saying, yes, you can talk about these particular things, and the student can change that at any time. So again, students are in the driver's seat because of FERPA. Exceptions to FERPA include health and safety emergencies, or an educational need to know. So again, if the student is not doing well and we're worried about their safety and how they are doing, of course, ourselves or other members of campus will reach out to family members to make sure that they're doing okay. But if the student's not doing well in class, if grades aren't doing the best, generally that's not a need to know situation. All right. All right, and thank you, Edwin, for checking the chat for us in case there are any questions. All right, next slide. Okay, so here we're going to be talking about our disability resources, policies, and procedures and how things work at DR at Case Western Reserve University. So our mission statement is we assist students with disabilities to fully participate in their chosen programs and activities. So that includes academics, housing, extracurricular programs, or if they're in any of our medical programs, their clinicals. We accomplish this through accommodations and individual consultations. So what we do is we meet with all of our students, we look at everything on that case-by-case basis, we see where the barriers are, and we can see how we can best and most reasonably address those. Common disability types are visual impairments, hearing impairments, mobility, dexterity impairments, chronic illness, psychological disorders, learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and temporary disabilities. So concussions, broken limbs, mono, anything like that, we can help students get temporary accommodations in order to help them as they recover through those things. But we work with a wide range of students and disabilities here. ADHD, anxiety, depression are some of our most common, but we work with a lot of different things. So some of our common accommodations, but this is not an exhaustive list as far as everything that we do, but we do provide testing accommodations, so that can be extra time. Also adaptive equipment and assistive technology, so if microphones are needed or different softwares. Scheduling assistance, so if students are needing some coaching and additional support with their time management. We can help with those that may not be a or accommodation, but we do provide that additional support. Transportation assistance, we are a larger campus, so if they need rides around campus, we can provide those. Alternative format for print materials, if it needs to be Braille, or if we need to get that in a larger print. Note-taking assistance, interpreters, parking assistance, accessible housing, flexible attendance and deadlines, and again, temporary accommodation. So some of these, if we have that documentation, they will be good until the student graduates, but for temporary things, we can set up things for a couple weeks as they're recovering from maybe their first concussion, or it may be for a whole semester. But when it comes to the documentation, we'll talk about what those needs are to make sure that we know the difference between whether it's a temporary or a permanent accommodation. So students, if they're wanting to register with our office, we do it through our program that's called AIM. So it's an online student application there. And that's the link to it, but don't worry about writing that down. If you go to the Disability Resources homepage and click on our Getting Started tab, it will be right there, and it'll go through the process as far as filling out that application and our documentation guidelines. When the application is filled out, documentation can be uploaded there, though sometimes the documentation may not be ready at the time of the application. That's perfectly fine. The documentation can be emailed or faxed to us at a later date. Once we reviewed that documentation, then we will reach out to the student at their college email address. And we do want to clarify that's with their case email. So as soon as they get that, they need to be checking that regularly, because that's how the college will be communicating with them primarily. Usually will not be through their private email. But we will be emailing them there and setting it up for them to schedule their intake appointment. And the intake appointments, we can do those over the summer. We usually start those for first years in June. For transfer students, it really can be at any time. We can have that appointment either in person if you're close to the area, or we can do that via Zoom. So everything is set up and ready to go before the semester starts. So some of our basic documentation guidelines, it must be from a qualified professional, so a licensed medical provider of some sort. The diagnosis of the disability and the current prognosis does need to be listed on there. So the information should include an explanation of the nature of the physical or mental impairment and its impact on any major life activity. So sometimes we'll get a letter and it'll say, this person has ADHD, but we realize in our office that ADHD impacts everyone differently. So what we ask is that we do know how it impacts them, what those limitations are, so we can really do that work as far as making sure that things are customized for the student and they're getting the support that they need. Any psychological or physical test data relevant to the diagnosis. So for things like ADHD and different learning disabilities, maybe the student had a neuropsychological evaluation done that has that whole battery of tests on there. And that can be really helpful for us to see where some of those obstacles are and how we can best address them. So feel free to send those tests on over to us, and that would work for us really well. And then history and or recommendations for accommodation. So how it's impacted them over time. Is this a new thing? Because sometimes that can help us, if it's a relatively new diagnosis, how to talk with the student, because maybe they don't have the language to know how to best describe it. So to know that history is really helpful. And then recommendations for accommodations. So we can really lean on what the medical experts are saying is like, this is what we think would be best for them. And then we can see if that would be a reasonable accommodation here. When it comes to determining accommodations, what we do is once we have that application and the documentation, we look at the source of the documentation, make sure that is appropriate. So the medical provider that is providing it, they are an expert in the field to where they would be able to make that sort of diagnosis. We want to make sure the documentation is complete. And again, on our website, we have all the time frames and those sorts of things. So neuropsychological educational evaluations, we understand that they're timely and they can be expensive. But if it's something that say that your student last got when they are 10 years old. We will likely need that to be updated so we can understand how things are best impacting them at this level of maturity. And it's also good to know, and this is just something to have on the radar, if your student is looking at any of our professional programs, if they're thinking they're going to go into grad school, medical school, or anything like that, and they're needing testing accommodations for the GRE, the MCAT, the LSAT, or anything like that, they usually need pretty new documentation within 5 years if it's at neuropsychological evaluation. So that's something on your student's future and their plan. That's something to have on your radar. Again, the information needs to be current, but that can really vary depending on the disability. If it's a chronic condition that really doesn't change over time, we can accept something that is a bit earlier. But for learning disabilities and other mental health disorders, those can really change over time. So we want to make sure we have the newest, best information so we know how to best support our students. We will also be checking to make sure the student qualifies as a person with a disability. So there may be accommodations that students hear about that they're like, oh, that would be really helpful. I would love to have flexible attendance. And we'll ask them one to be like, I'm just a little overwhelmed. Well, that could be signs of anxiety or depression, and we can help at looking for resources for them to get diagnosed with that. But feeling overwhelmed or anything like that wouldn't qualify as a disability. So we want to make sure that the student does legally qualify as that. And again, the documentation supports the requested accommodations. When students fill out our application, it will have a list of accommodations there that they may be interested in. So say they have ADHD, and then they see the option for a single room, like, oh, that would be great. I would love to have a single room on campus. For us to see if the accommodation is reasonable or not, it needs to be related to the diagnosis. So while something may be beneficial, it may be helpful, it may not be reasonable. So when we're looking at that documentation, we need to see that connection between what the student is asking for and what the medical diagnosis and what those recommendations are. When it comes to the accommodation implementation, so when students fill out that application, they will be creating their profile through AIM, and that's going to be our program that they use for all things. So that's reserving testing spaces if they have testing accommodations. That's where they request their accommodation letters to be sent to their professors each semester. That's where they can find notes if they have note takers. It's really the hub for all things. So when they fill out that application, their profile will be created. The accommodations, they are reviewed by the student during their intake meeting. We do require intake meetings with all of our students just to make sure that we, again, are understanding how things impact them the most, because while we have the documentation, we want to make sure that we understand how the student explains things and how they say that things impact them. And a lot of times the documentation may not go into those sort of details. So we want to make sure we know those sorts of things. So the intake meeting will be imperative for us to approve accommodations. The student also will need to select which courses and which accommodations they will submit for their professors. We'll take them through those steps, but students will be able to pick and choose when they want to use accommodations and which ones they do want to use for which classes. So say if they have testing accommodations, but they're taking a art class that doesn't have any tests in it, they can choose not to request them in there. Though usually for their first semester, we just say request them all for all of their classes, because there's no penalty for not using an accommodation. And then lastly, the student makes arrangements to meet with their instructors to discuss their accommodations. So this is not something that will be built in, and this could be something that's really different from secondary education. So when those letters of accommodations are sent to their professors and we email them, we copy students in those emails so they'll see exactly what they see. And all that I will say is that they are registered with our office and that they're approved for these accommodations. We do not have any of their diagnosis information on that because we don't feel like the instructors need to know those details. They need to know how the accommodations, which ones are approved and which ones they need to talk through as far as how they will work. So we ask all of our students to talk to each of their instructors to see how their accommodations will work. like with testing, flexible attendance, or anything like that, because it really can vary from class to class. And then also in that way too, it'll help to start build relationships with the instructor. So if there are ever already questions or any concerns or anything like that, they will hopefully feel comfortable asking them those questions. Temporary accommodations, we also provide those. So if students have concussions or anything like that, we can provide an extended time on exams, scribes for exams or quizzes if, like, say they have a broken arm or a sprain, peer note takers, flexible attendance for a certain amount of time, if they have any doctor's appointments and those sorts of things, responsive transportation, and then accessible parking. So if they have a broken leg and need help getting around campus, we can get them those closer parking spots, or accessible park, or using the shuttle that goes around campus. So here's our contact information. Our phone number is 216-368-5230. There's our fax number in case there's any documentation that needs to be faxed to us. Our email address is disability@case.edu, and we do prefer that people communicate to us via email. That email address goes to all of the people that work in our office. I'm one of 5 people here, so if one of us is out, someone else can answer those questions. Our website is the case.edu/student-life/disability. Though if you type in disability resources on our website, we will be the first thing that pops up. And then there is our mailing address as well.